Well, good morning and greetings, friends. We're back. It's Paul Thompson with Steve Autrey. We're back for our third Wednesday podcast, Wednesday, October 12th. And we're delighted that you are here. This past Sunday at Huntersville United Methodist Church, I hope you enjoyed the conversation around the Lord's Prayer dialogue. It was fun for me to be able to share in this conversation with God based around the Lord's Prayer. I hope that you drew something from that about prayer and how conversational prayer is to be with God. And Steve, talk to me about Denver.
Well, so we spent a lot of time on the Lord's Prayer and working through how that is the model prayer. But I think underneath that, I hope the big takeaway is that you can learn to pray. Because, if you couldn't, why would Jesus give us a prayer to teach us?
Yeah, I think that's a really good reminder that actually prayer may not be as natural for us. It is something that we can learn to do, maybe to do better, so that indeed our experience of God becomes more in depth.
Mm-hmm. And also I issued a challenge to model some of our prayer life on Daniel. And if you remember from the Daniel passage, Daniel prayed on his knees 3 times a day. And so the challenge was, can you find a place in your life where 3 times, once in the morning, sometime around lunch, and once in the evening, that you bow before God physically on your knees in a place and offer up a prayer to God, even if it's just for a few moments, just to create a response and an action. So I hope the folks at Denver are taking that to heart and continuing it through the week.
Yeah, maybe our folks at Huntersville can learn a little bit from that too, that prayer is primarily, it's conversation with God, and it may be more on God's end than our end.
Well, right, and one of the things in doing some research about prayer, Eugene Peterson says that the first word is always God's.
Yeah.
Our prayer is answering speech, speaking back to that which God has already spoken into our lives.
So this week we transition to the next in the sermon series as to how we experience God, the influence of God. And Steve, it doesn't get any better than this one today. If we can't find something good to say here today, we need to go back to farming cows and bushes and all that we used to do or could do.
Used to be able to do.
Yeah, used to be able to do. So today we're going to focus our conversation around how to experience God through Jesus Christ. And man, this is where it all begins for us.
It is. Without that, there would be no Christian faith. And I think sometimes because we've lived with the idea of Jesus for 2,000 years, that it's hard for us to comprehend just how radical, how to the first century Jew, how crazy what Jesus was saying happened to be. When you think about first century Judaism, how did they think of God? Right? God is remote,
wholly distant.
God doesn't even have a name, right? The Yahweh is not a name.
You would not even speak that word.
You wouldn't even come close to the. And then God had a home in the temple. And nobody really got close to God, and especially back in that area where that was set aside just for God in the Holy of Holies. So that whole idea of God being close and intimate and even conversational, that wasn't in their mindset at all.
So we begin our conversation around experiencing God in Jesus today with really a conversation around what does it mean that God took on human flesh? What does it mean that God decided not to stay distant, not to stay, other, but to become one of us and to live among us? And we call that word?
The Incarnation.
The Incarnation. We touched briefly in a previous podcast on this idea of incarnation, but let's flesh that out a little bit deeper. Around the idea of
nature, we took some of Richard Rohr's teachings that creation is the first incarnation of God. In other words, creation expresses who God is, and it certainly does. But you can talk to a tree. I don't know if the tree's going to talk back.
If it does, you might want to come see one of us, and we can figure out where to go next.
And we'll refer you to someone.
Yeah.
But what does it mean that a human person is God? So incarnation, the word literally means to take on the flesh. And one of the texts that we use for this is the Gospel of John, because John is trying to explain to people how this works, and what he wants people to know, and what he wants his audience to know is, look, this has been a part of who God is from the very beginning.
Yeah, we often think about the Christmas story as Luke, shepherds and angels and wise men and all of that, but really the Gospel of John really cuts more to the core of the theology of Jesus as God incarnate. So maybe you would read a portion of that for us from the Gospel of John, chapter 1.
Typically, this is known as the prologue to John's Gospel. John chapter 1, verse 1 begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through Him, and without Him not one thing came into being. What has come into being, in Him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it."
And then there's verse 14, chapter 1, verse 14, that really brings it together.
So let me read that one. "And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen His glory, that glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth."
So let's begin, Steve, unpacking when it says in the beginning was the Word, capital W, and the Word, capital W, was with God, and the Word was God. That word for word means it's logos.
Yes. Yeah.
What's the sense of that word?
It's the pre-existence of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
That is part and parcel of who God is. That it was all there in the beginning. And that Jesus isn't something that God thought up along the way. Jesus is not a plan B.
Jesus was co-eternal with God. Jesus is that expression of the wisdom, the teaching, the idea of God's presence is the Word. It's that spoken word. Mm-hmm. It comes out a little bit in Genesis chapter 1 when we say that God breathed all things into existence.
Yes.
It is that sense that the breath, the wind of God, that spoken word, that's how God created.
Yeah, and in Genesis you get those images of both spoken word and God breathing life into the human creature, but you don't get a word without breath.
So, Steve, let's put some practical application to this idea. So what does it mean for us? How can we experience God in Jesus, especially in this idea of incarnation, that God became one of us? What's the flesh of that?
I like that part.
That's good. That was right. Yeah. I'm so smart.
You are. You're so something. The idea of God in Jesus then means that if you want to know who God is, you look to Jesus. And that we best understand God and experience God through the historical person of Jesus and the writings in the Gospels, but also the ongoing reality that Jesus is resurrected and present in this world. And that's an interesting kind of thing, because what that means is we have to undertake a study of who Jesus is. We have to pay attention to who Jesus is. And if you think about early Christians weren't called Christians.
No.
They were called people of
the way.
The way of who?
The way of Jesus.
Jesus. So it was like, and when Jesus asked people to come and become part of what He's doing, almost all of them, He says, "Come, follow me." Right? Nicodemus, He says, buddy, you got to start over. To everybody else, He says, "Come, follow me. See what I'm about. Watch how I interact with people. Learn from me." And what is He teaching them? He's teaching them the values of the kingdom of God.
One of the real struggles that I find with folks is that they see a very different God in the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And I get it. I understand it. It is hard to look back at the Old Testament and not be, perplexed by what we read there, by what we see there. But my belief has always been that we really couldn't see God until we see Jesus. Yeah. And in Jesus Christ, we see the perfect fulfillment. This is who God is. This is what we're supposed to know. I truly believe that Jesus is the living embodiment of the Old Testament, and all of those things that God taught in the Old Testament really become clear because Jesus lived them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says, I didn't come to abolish the Old Testament, or in other words, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. I didn't come to undo what came before, I came to show you what it really means.
The Apostle Paul says in Galatians 5:14 that all of the law simply boils down to one expression. It's how we love our neighbors. Jesus takes that same sentiment in one of the Gospels in Mark when he's asked, okay, boil the whole law down for us. What does it really boil down to? Jesus says, love God by loving your neighbor. So we really do find that the whole way that we understand the way we are to relate to God is by relating to one another in ways that honor the God is in each of us. We are all made in that image of God. So that really becomes the real fulfillment. Jesus embodies God.
Yeah. And we'll pick up those kind of ideas tomorrow as we continue talking about how we experience God by experiencing Jesus.
We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.